Hi all, welcome to MeDIDa, a podcast analysing all sorts of media about multiplicity and dissociative identity disorder. We're talking books, movies, television, gaming, and more. Whether it's overt or covert, intentional or unintentional, I want to talk about it. I'm your podcast host, Avodacat. I am a fully fused system, which means my multiplicity is no longer compartmentalized, and I'm constantly intrigued by the way that media that isn't intentionally representing plurality almost always does a better job of it compared to media that is actively setting out to represent it. This podcast is not necessarily a place that is here to educate about DID, multiplicity, and plurality. If you want educational content about plurality, there are several other places you can find it, both online and offline. This is specifically to review and analyze media. So if you, like me, have opinions on things, stick around and join in the discussion. This podcast is recorded on Kaurna country, and I extend my respect to the traditional custodians of the land and elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. This is still stolen land without any Indigenous treaty. The land I am on impacts how I go about my day-to-day life, including my media analysis, so this acknowledgement of country is very important. Today we will be discussing the short film Petals of a Rose, directed by Dylan Crumpler and also written by Dylan Crumpler and Holly Crumpler. This 15-minute short film was originally created as Dylan Crumpler's senior film thesis, but has since blown up worldwide. It was released publicly in 2023, I believe first being shown in a private screening in the System Speaks community in 2022, before being screened at film festivals and received overall a lot of positive acclaim. It won the Best Trauma Film Award at the Believe Psychology Film Festival in 2023 and the MeDIDa Award at ISSTD in 2024. Petals of a Rose is the story of a day in the life of a woman with dissociative identity disorder. On Dylan Crumpler's website, he explains why he chose to create this film and states, Dylan grew up with a mother who has dissociative identity disorder. Given that DID has often been inaccurately and negatively portrayed in film and television, Dylan envisioned and created this film to realistically depict a day in the life of a woman with DID in an engaging and educational way. While Dylan himself is not multiple, his mother and Petals of a Rose co-writer, Holly Crumpler, is multiple, so there is definitely a reasonable degree of lived experience that informs this piece. The short film is available to watch for free on Dylan Crumpler's website, dylancrumpler.com, and because this podcast is primarily analysing multiplicity, representation, and media, the details of the film will be discussed at length. So if you would like to have the experience of the film without spoilers, please go and watch it first. It will take less than 15 minutes of your day, and I believe you will be better for it. Along with the film, Dylan Crumpler also wrote a short paper titled How Dissociative Identity Disorder is Accurately Portrayed in Petals of a Rose, which is available on the website as well at the bottom of the film page, and I will occasionally be referencing this document throughout this review, as well as several interviews that Dylan and Holly have participated in through podcasts such as the System Speaks podcast, a couple of multiple podcasts, the Healing My Parts podcast, and several others. I also recommend checking out these podcast interviews if you are interested. You can find them on the Petals of a Rose link tree. I was not aware of this film when it was released, as at the time I had recently fully fused, and I had become more distant from many plural communities online. I became aware of the film this year after beginning this podcast, as many plural communities discussed how meaningful this film is to them and how well it portrays the experience of DID. So naturally, I had to check out this film that everybody loved so much and put my own 2 cents in. I am going to say right at the top here that this review discusses aspects of the film that I think are both positive, as well as aspects that I think are negative or could be improved. I understand that a lot of people love this film and feel very seen by this film, and I am not trying to diminish all of that through this discussion. I do think that this is a fantastic film, but I also believe that we should always be striving for better and more representation. But I do also understand that some people have a deep emotional connection with this film. So if you are not in a place where you think you can hear someone discussing any negative aspects, please feel free to leave this episode and check out another. Make sure that you are looking out for yourself and your system. There is a lot of positive content regarding this movie out there. For example, Brigade of Beans a YouTube channel, recently did a real-time reaction review on their YouTube channel. In an interview on the System Speaks podcast, Holly and Dylan discuss how Holly was diagnosed later in life. Holly found out when she was in her 50s, and at that time Dylan was already 20. So although he did grow up with a mother with DID, neither of them were aware until very recently about the multiplicity aspect. Not long after this, I think Dylan was 21, they began to make the film together. I think this is important to point out because although there is lived experience being explored here, there is also something to be said for how new this information is to both Dylan and Holly. And I think that makes an impact in how it's presented because of the limited exposure both of them had to this at the time. Much of the dialogue from the film came directly from Holly and how she and her system would respond to a given situation. It is fiction, but it is also very autobiographical of Holly's own system. Both Dylan and Holly have talked about how they have learnt how many stories are out there and how big the gap is in representation, and that this film is not the end of the story for multiplicity representation. Petals of a Rose follows Rose as she anxiously prepares for a Valentine's Day dinner with her boyfriend Jeremy. In the supermarket, 3 alters are triggered out due to various external and internal stimuli. Josie, a child alter, is triggered out upon seeing a teddy bear. Axel, a protective alter, is triggered out when they are confronted by a store clerk. And Superwoman, an emotionally protective alter, is triggered out when the internal chatter becomes too overwhelming for Rose to handle. Superwoman finishes the shopping, goes home, and prepares the house for the upcoming date, switching back to Rose when it is time. Rose then sits down and reminds Josie, Axel, and Superwoman that Jeremy loves her and they are safe with him. While waiting, Rose's anxiety gets the better of her, egged on by Axel's goading about how she should never have trusted Jeremy, resulting in Axel briefly switching in just as the doorbell rings. Axel opens it, and it is Jeremy, and Rose switches immediately back in. They have a wonderful date, and things escalate to a more intimate setting, but unfortunately Rose experiences a flashback, dissociating and causing Axel to come out protectively and escape to the bathroom. After calming Axel down, Rose returns to front, returns to Jeremy, and attempts to explain, with Superwoman's help, what happened, disclosing her past trauma and the fact that she has DID. Jeremy comforts Rose and states that even though he doesn't understand it, he still loves Rose. The short ends with Rose thanking her alters and stating that she is going to try to continue to work with each of them to process traumas and ensure that they feel safe. Petals of a Rose is intentional, explicit representation of multiplicity, specifically created to provide a more accurate representation of life with DID, as much of the representation is full of misconceptions and misinformation, often sensationalizing this disorder and portraying people with DID as dangerous and violent. This film actively tries to push back against those sort of betrayals. But how much does it succeed? Let's talk about it. Let's start with the system. The system overall does not have a name, which is not necessarily unusual. Some systems like to go by a system name, others prefer to use the host's name or just not have any collective name. The host is named Rose, and there is an implication that it is also the body's legal name, so that is how I will largely be referring to the system, as Rose or Rose's system. There is also Josie, a childlike alter, which are commonly referred to as littles within the DID community. Axel, a male protective alter who appears to front when the body feels physically threatened. And Superwoman, an emotional protector who could be referred to as an apparently normal part, as she allows the body to function without having to process the emotional baggage of the system. The paper that Dylan Crumpler wrote to accompany the film states that Rose is the host and an apparently normal part, Josie is a little, Axel is an abusive introject/misguided protector, and Superwoman is an introject of a fictional character, which is essentially a fictive, and also an apparently normal part. These are the alters we see, but the ending implies that there are additional alters or parts, as the film refers to them, that we do not get to see or hear throughout the film. Something that I really appreciate is that 2 of the alters, Axel and Josie, are portrayed by different actors than the actor portraying Rose, visually showing that they are differentiated identity states. While Superwoman is the same actor as Rose, but in a Superwoman costume, which may indicate that these parts are less differentiated compared to Josie and Axel. I do also like that the clever editing is done for switches, as it feels smooth and seamless, managing to show what is occurring internally, while also displaying to the audience that externally the change is significantly less obvious. There are no sudden clothing changes upon switches, as there are in a lot of more sensationalized DID media. Somehow, managing to pull this off without creating any confusion for the audience is incredible, in my opinion. I also really do need to comment on the amazing editing and shot composition of the films. It is fantastic, and I do think that Dylan Crumpler has a good eye for directing. Already, just from these 2 points alone, this is leagues ahead of portrayals like The United States of Tara, which I sort of use as a benchmark, as it was one of the first depictions of DID I personally saw in media, and I also gave this series a 3 out of 5 for plural representation, which to me sort of feels like should be the average benchmark. I do think that the switching within Petals of a Rose happens very fast, which I do not necessarily feel represents how diverse switches can be. So switches can be diverse not just between systems, but also within a system. Most systems experience a large range of switches. Sometimes they're fast, sometimes they're slow, sometimes someone accidentally fronts, sometimes someone is trying to front and can't. There's just a wide range of experiences when it comes to switching. Petals of a Rose displays only one kind of switching. It's fast and it's triggered. To be fair, it does make sense, as it would be the case that Rose is extremely anxious due to the upcoming date with Jeremy, so the fast switching is reflecting that anxiety and emotional turmoil. I also understand that this is a 15-minute short film, so they are very limited in how much that they can show. But considering it is specifically looking to represent the lived experience, it seems like a bit of an oversight to not at least mention or imply that switching is not always like this. I do like that Josie is triggered out on a positive trigger of bears, and even though this is a short film, they make it a reoccurring motif for her character, as she is also triggered out when Jeremy presents Rose with a teddy bear as part of her present.
Oh my god, I love bears! How did you know?
Wow, I didn't know you loved bears so much.
Of course, silly, bears are the best!
Side note, when in the store, Rose promised Josie would be allowed to play when she got home if she didn't buy the bear at the supermarket. And yet, when they get home, Superwoman and Rose immediately prepare for the date with Jeremy and just completely disregard the promise to Josie, which seems really rude. Guys, don't just make promises to your littles and then not follow through. Or any of your alters, really. It's just rude. It's particularly rude since Rose then goes on to demand that Josie not be present for the date. Like, imagine making demands after breaking your promise. This is not a real criticism of the movie. Alters are flawed people too. It's just a thing I noticed and I wanted to bring up. I do like the representation of co-consciousness and internal chatter, which sometimes occurs as clear conversational voices or an overwhelming cacophony of voices overlapping in a way that cannot be understood clearly.
Why not just eat pie for dinner?
Last time I looked just fine. You're wasting your time. It's so hard. I just want to get some meat.
This, I feel, is very real to my own lived experience, and even though I am fully fused, I have found this internal chatter is just a constant part of my life. It's just a little less differentiated than it used to be. Honestly, the degree of difference between fusion and functional multiplicity is a very fine, blurry line in my opinion. This aspect is one that many depictions do overlook, so I greatly appreciate its inclusion in this short film. I also like that there is disagreement between alters and that they have to internally navigate these disagreements. Specifically, there's a lot of tension between Rose and Axel, as Axel does not view Jeremy as trustworthy, which makes sense as he's a protector, and it's only natural that he would be slow to trust. Axel feels that Rose is actively putting them in danger and in a dangerous situation, and it's a kind of disagreement that is common within systems and can be very difficult to navigate. The one part that I am less thrilled about is that the internal conversations are often partly externalized. Often Rose is speaking out loud when conversing with her alters. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't happen. I've done it myself in the past, and I know other systems also externally converse. However, the way this film externalizes these conversations in a highly emotional and triggered way with erratic movements and hostile tone feels a little uncomfortable to me. This is not something that felt relatable to me as a covert system, as these sort of actions draw unwanted attention. I feel like when you are purposefully making a film where your goal is to break stigma around DID, showing your primary character as erratic in an early scene is perhaps not the best way to change minds around the idea that systems are unpredictable and dangerous. The scene where this occurs, I feel, could have been a great opportunity and great excuse to include more moments of dissociation within the film, rather than a stereotypical erratic behaviour. The argument between Rose and Axel still could have proceeded as per the film, but fully internally rather than externally. Only audible for the audience through voiceovers, but not audible at all for the people in the store in-universe. This could have occurred while Rose dissociates and stares into space, and then the store clerk can suddenly ask if she needs help, trigger Axel in the same way that he is triggered in the film, jumping into protection mode. Not only would this have removed a stereotypical moment that may reinforce negative preconceptions and negative stereotypes around systems, but it also could have been a moment to more accurately portray dissociation, which is a hugely overlooked symptom of dissociative disorders and not well portrayed in any media, in my opinion. Speaking of, there was unfortunately very little dissociation displayed within the film at all. There is a short moment of dissociation when Rose and Jeremy attempt intimacy, and a traumatic memory is triggered, but this moment is over very quickly and is followed by another fast switch where Axel comes out to physically protect the body from the perceived threat. There is also emotional dissociation shown with Superwoman as she emotionally dissociates in order to be more functional. And while I appreciate these moments, it is frustrating to me that the dissociation aspect of DID does not get shown more. Dylan Crumpler's accompanying paper, How Dissociative Identity Disorder is Accurately Portrayed in Petals of a Rose, does not provide any additional insight into how dissociation is being portrayed in the film beyond a passage on amnesia, which is a form of dissociation. Amnesia is displayed in the film when Rose returns from the grocery store and only then discovers all the pies her identities have picked out. Except, this scene was actually cut from the final film, so we don't get any explicit representations of dissociation within this film, dissociative amnesia or otherwise. This is a consistent problem with the idea and multiplicity media, in my opinion, where a dissociative disorder is attempting to be explicitly portrayed, but there is little to no dissociation actually shown, just the implied dissociative barriers between alters. Dissociation is a key component to dissociative identity disorder, which is what this film claims to be portraying accurately. From what I have seen and heard within multiple circles, this is one of the most lauded explicit media representation out there. So for even this film to overlook such an important aspect of DID is incredibly disappointing and frustrating. When Rose and Superwoman attempt to explain DID to Jeremy, the analogy of slices of pie is used, explaining that each of the alters is represented as a slice, and together they make up the pie that is Rose.
I'm like this pie.
Within the universe of the film, this is because there is a pie immediately in front of Rose at the time, and so using it as a narrative device in the moment makes sense. If this was a real moment that occurred, being portrayed with the implication that it was not the best explanation, I would probably be a little bit more forgiving. To its credit, Rose does express that she feels she is not explaining it well. However, we do have to remember that this film was scripted and planned, and that the pie analogy was not something that they just came up with on the fly like the character did. This is a film that set out to actively portray DID accurately. So for that reason, I have to say I really do not like the pie slice analogy. It feels very similar to the broken vase theory, the idea that alters are shards of a broken whole that just need to be stuck back together to be whole. This implicates that alters are in a fixed state of being, which is not accurate to most systems. And I really wish that people would stop reinventing the broken vase metaphor, because I find it personally incredibly frustrating. I also don't understand why they don't just go with the rosebush cutting theory, particularly because the movie is called Petals of a Rose, and the main character/host's name is Rose. It would be an absolutely fantastic moment of symbolism. For those that are unaware, the rosebush cutting theory posits that rather than being shards or slices, altars are more like cuttings from a rosebush, something that is alive and changing and growing. These cuttings can be planted separately from the bush they originated and grow into their own plant, different from the original. And if you attempted to construct these cuttings back together, it would not be as simple as arranging broken pieces back together, because the rose bushes are living things that they grow and change over time. So they were not the same as they were when the separation happened. Again, I just feel like it would have made so much more sense for this to occur, and there would have been the perfect excuse, as Jeremy had given Rose a bouquet of roses for Valentine's Day, so it could have easily been incorporated as a set piece in the line of sight for Rose to have the thought to use that analogy. It is entirely possible that Dylan and Holly were unaware of this analogy, as I have found is true of many people within the DID community that I have talked to recently, who do not seem aware of it. Whereas I feel that about a decade ago, from my perspective at least, it was a relatively prominent analogy used within the community. So it may just have fallen out of style, fallen out of favour, forgotten, who knows. But I do wish some more thought had gone into that particular moment, because I am sick of the broken vase theory being reimagined, especially reimagined as food. I don't know why, but people love to reimagine it as food, and it frustrates me. I do not want to be compared to a pie or a pizza, actually. But ultimately, the pie slice analogy is used, and this analogy, along with Rose's later monologue, implies that the altars other than Rose are stuck in time and not developed or changed. Within a system, there are different types of altars, some of which are stuck in time. They may be stuck within a specific experience, a specific moment of memory, or they may just be stuck at a specific age. But this is not the only type of altar that exists. Within most systems, there are also altars who do change and grow over time. The altars we get to see within Petals of a Rose are also very stereotypical. A child altar, a physical protector, an emotional protector / functional part. They have one specific role and do not necessarily feel like a fully formed identity outside of this role. Again, some systems do have these sort of highly specific types of altars, but I do find that all altars other than the host being portrayed in this overly stereotypical way just adds more to the misconception that altars are parts that broke away from the host, and that the host is the true identity within the system, perpetuating the concept that all systems have an original and true identity. This idea being perpetuated in the media, being raised up as an accurate portrayal of DID is, to be honest, pretty distressing to me. Many systems do not believe that there is an original identity, particularly as the current scientific understanding of structural dissociation, as far as I am aware, states that there is not a solid cohesive state of identity until about the ages of 7 to 11. And this has been widely recognized for some time now. While I know that this is not an idea that all systems agree with many older systems still accepting the idea of an original or core identity based on the information they had when they were first diagnosed, I would honestly expect better from a film that claims to be accurately portraying DID with the express purpose of fighting against stigma. And I hope that future projects that Dylan and Holly pursue in the same vein do better in this area. Within the film, the pie analogy explanation goes relatively well, and Jeremy is very open and understanding. So let's take a moment to talk about Jeremy, who doesn't play a huge role but does play an important role. His presence in the system's life is part of what's throwing them into turmoil, as their relationship is becoming more intimate, which can be incredibly difficult for those who suffered intense trauma and abuse from those close to them. Within the film, the main character was the victim of childhood sexual assault perpetrated by her grandfather, which is a biographical detail taken directly from Holly's own life. So the system is on high alert, and Rose attempts to assure them that Jeremy is safe and loves her. Jeremy is presented as very loving and romantic within the film, and when Rose is triggered by the sexual intimacy, he responds with concern. He actively listens to Rose as she tries to explain what is going on, and even though he acknowledges that he does not fully understand it, he is open and curious to learn, and still loves Rose. He stays.
Do you still love me?
Of course I do. I love you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I didn't know how you're going to react, if you were going to get mad, or if you're going to leave me, or just...
Hey,
I don't...
no.
It's so complicated and I'm not explaining it well.
No, it's not you. I've never heard of any of this before. But I really do want to understand.
This was a super powerful moment within the film, particularly given how stigmatized DID is and how often people will reject or leave relationships when their partner discloses their diagnosis. During the first screening in the System Speaks community, those that were there discussed how meaningful it was that Jeremy responded so well because of how often media and reality leave systems abandoned and feeling undeserving of love. Something that disappointed me on a more personal level was the lack of an inner world. A headspace where the alters exist when they aren't fronting or co-conscious with the body. At least we are never shown any inner world. Alters are often shown visually present at the same time within the same physical room as each other, but this seems to be more of a representation of co-consciousness or co-fronting and not explicitly a representation of an inner world. I am not personally the biggest fan of this sort of representation of co-consciousness in on-screen representation, where the alters appear as if they are physically present in the actual room with the host/body. And interestingly, Dylan Crumpler also does not seem that fond of this trope either. He spoke in the Couple of Multiples podcast, as well as several other podcasts, about how frustrating it is in movies and shows that alters are often shown as interacting separately with real-world objects away from the body or are represented as hallucinations. And yet, this is still the choice he made with his own film. It's maybe something that came from the limitations of the format, or something Dylan has changed his mind on later, or even something that Dylan sees as specifically different within his own work, but it is still something that I personally do not like. While we don't get to see the inner world, there is an implication that it is present within the system. Not all systems have an inner world, but this system is implied to have one. When Rose tells Josie to go to her marshmallow castle so that Rose can be alone with Jeremy, the audience can interpret this as something internal, a part of the inner world, but that's really the only hint we get of an inner world. For many systems, the inner world is a significant part of their lives, particularly as for a lot of alters outside of, say, a host, it is where they spend the majority of their time. Not all systems have an inner world, as I said earlier, but this does not seem to be the case for this system being represented in this film. So there was a specific choice to not attempt to show the internal world of this system. Again, I know this is a short film, and there are limitations to what you can do within those 15 minutes, so I understand that perhaps certain things that they may have wanted to include had to be left on the cutting room floor. However, considering this film, again, is actively presenting itself as an accurate portrayal of DID, I don't think it's unfair to present the ways in which it maybe fell short of that goal, and not representing the inner world is a way that I felt like it fell short of that goal. I also picked up on something within the short that I cannot tell if it was an intentional aspect of the film or not, but I felt that it was a very genuine part of multiplicity that is worth exploring. This is purely speculation based on what I perceived within the short film, and it honestly might be an incredible reach, but I do briefly want to talk about Axel.
It's not appropriate for you to be there.
As a protector alter, he also exhibits signs of potentially straying into persecutor territory, with the insults directed towards Rose and the self-harm that occurs while triggered. But along with this, to me, he also reads as queer. He has quite a feminine demeanour, and much of what he says feels deliberately sassy. Now, this may simply be because the body is female, and the actor portraying Axel, Justin Libby, may have been instructed or may have made the choice to act accordingly in order to create a more apparent linkage between Axel and Rose. But it also could have been performed in this way for other reasons, or it may have been completely unintentional within the performance. Still, I feel like it is an opportunity for me to discuss a favourite topic of mine. Listeners of the podcast will have heard me bring this up time and time again, neuroqueer theory. I do want to clarify this term, as I believe I have been mischaracterizing it through oversimplifying it. Neuroqueer is a term that is a combination of the term queering as a verb and neuro as a prefix, and it's a practice of disrupting or acting counter to both neuronormativity and heteronormativity. When I point out these characters as neuroqueer, it is partly because they can be perceived as both neurodivergent and queer, but it's also because the simple act of these characters existing the way that they do is a neuroqueer action within media. It is showing a way of existing that goes against the rules that dictate both a neuronormative world and a heteronormative world simultaneously. The way a fictional character is presented is an active choice from the creators. So presenting a character that is neurodivergent and queer within a fictional narrative is a neuroqueer action. I think this is important to clarify because you do not need to be queer or neurodivergent to be neuroqueer or act in a neuroqueer manner. And I think the way I was previously discussing it may have led people to believe that you did have to be queer or neurodivergent. With that being said, Axel being a character within a system, as a protector/persecutor part, also being not traditionally masculine feels like a neuroqueer action within the film, whether it's intentional or not. Again, I may be really reaching with this one, as none of the alters really got that fleshed out within the 15-minute runtime, but I still think there's something there. And on that note, really, that's the biggest complaint I have, is the short runtime. There are multiple problems I see with the short runtime, honestly. Short films generally cannot provide a fleshed out story or as much of a character exploration compared to full feature-length films. We do not just have one character we're exploring here either. We have 4. We have Rose, Axel, Josie, and Superwoman. So due to the limitation of how short it is, these characters do not get to feel as much like fully developed identities, and as I said earlier, end up representing stereotypes more than complex personhoods. Another point against the length is the fact that short films typically do not get any real level of recognition or promotion compared to a feature-length film. It is not something that can be released independently within theatres outside of a film festival. At best, it would be presented as a short or added as a bumper before an actual film people came to see. People are less likely to come across it organically, as the short film is largely only shared within the DID and psychology communities and is not necessarily that well known outside of those contexts. It is disappointing that a film that seeks to dispel misinformation and provide an accurate portrayal, actively trying to combat harmful media depictions, can never truly rise to that mantle due to its format. I am aware that it is likely that a full feature-length film was probably not possible, or at least would have been a much more difficult feat to successfully pull off, because this was a senior thesis film, so I have sympathy for what it is attempting to do. It is just frustrating that something like this, a short indie film that generally the public is significantly less aware of, is some of the best media representation we have. Meanwhile, we get hugely well-known movies like Split and series about Billy Milligan out there in the general public still actively creating stigma around DID with nobody challenging them at that level. I don't think it's wrong to say that we still need more than this. We need more explicit, positive, and diverse representation across multiple media types to truly have any chance at challenging the stigma society has against DID and multiplicity. While reception from the DID community has been overwhelmingly positive for Petals of a Rose, there are some criticisms I have seen online. I am not alone in thinking that this movie has the potential to be improved. Some people have even reached out to me privately as they feel afraid to openly criticize the film that so many people love and feel so deeply connected to. So I hope that this episode makes those who maybe do not feel as connected to the movie or have criticism feel less isolated in that. Sarcastic, a polyfragmented or complex DID system, has commented online via an Instagram post that while the movie may get many things right, like the emotional reality and internal system cooperation, there are definitely things it misses with regards to system representation. So I'm going to read directly from that post. The following is the Sarcasted's Instagram post from the 19th of February 2026. Our take on one of the most popular short films in the DID community. Petals of a Rose, Dissociative Identity Disorder Accurately Portrayed as a Complex System. Petals of a Rose is a short psychological drama written and directed by Dylan Crumpler and released in 2023. It's about 15 minutes long. It portrays a young woman named Rose who is the host of a DID system. The film captures her internal experiences, switching, time loss, internal conflict, in a way that's more subjective and experiential rather than clinical. It's often shared in DID communities because it represents systemhood from the inside rather than sensationalizing it, thus making it one of the more widely circulated short films on the topic. What Petals of a Rose gets right. Subjective internal experience. It tries to show dissociation from the inside rather than turning DID into a thriller trope. That already puts it ahead of things like Split, which lean into sensationalism. Emotional reality. The overwhelm, the internal conflict, the exhaustion, the freaking out, the fear of what would happen if they tell someone else that they're a system. That tracks with the lived experience shared in DID communities, big time. Cooperation. It shows alters working together. That's real. Many systems function through negotiation, internal communication, and shared goals. Not necessarily constant chaos. We also appreciate the way the host talked to the rest of the system. Supportive partner betrayal. The explanation scene is grounded. No horror movie reaction, just confusion, care, and effort to understand. That's pretty important. What Petals of a Rose misses, especially for polyfrags. The host as manager/repairer narrative. It centers the idea that one main person holds responsibility for stabilizing everyone else. That fits some smaller or more structurally stable systems, but many systems change hosts repeatedly, have no actual host or more than one, experience sudden fronting without any kind of preparation, wake up in a life they don't recognize as theirs, and take forever to cope. That waking up into someone else's life experience, hearing the body's name and not feeling like yours, inheriting relationships you didn't build, dealing with the consequences you didn't create, it's almost never depicted in media, and it's a huge thing. Host-centrism doesn't reflect reality for many systems. Even in smaller systems or simpler systems, the host isn't always in charge or listened to all of the time. Showing a system that functions like that usually reflects years of therapy, self-work, or stabilization, not the average everyday experience. Structural simplicity. The system shown is relatively clean and compartmentalized. In polyfrag or highly complex systems, layers exist, subsystems, fragments, side systems, groups. Switching can be subtle and rapid, with co-fronting happening regularly. Identity boundaries can blur a lot. Internal organization can be chaotic or hierarchical. That complexity doesn't show up here. Terminology. Using parts reflects common clinical language, e.g. some trauma models, but many systems strongly prefer alters or headmates. The language debate is ongoing and heavily tied to autonomy and personhood, so we get it, even though we wish alters wouldn't be reduced to just parts anymore. How Petals of a Rose compares to the lived experience. From lived reports in DID communities, most smaller systems feel very accurately represented. Many complex systems feel only partially seen. Polyfragmented systems feel invisible in mainstream portrayals. Host-centrism doesn't reflect systems where alters authority is distributed. That said, it is one of the more respectful portrayals out there. It just represents a narrower slice of the spectrum. Yes, it's true that smaller systems, quote, regular DID is more common. There are already plenty of portrayals, and most get it wrong. Producers can nail sci-fi or futuristic ideas, yet rarely show a glimpse of complex or polyfragmented systems, which are very real, non-fictional experiences. It's not asking too much. It's asking for stories that reflect the full spectrum of lived experiences. Stories they could get right if they just looked at the community. If you liked that post, I highly recommend checking out Sarcastids on Instagram. I agree that the singular experience of a system does not truly represent the diverse range of experiences within multiplicity. I do think that the language is a more contentious topic, as I personally use parts, alters, headmates, and such somewhat interchangeably. I do think it is an important point to bring up, though, as Dylan Crumpler wrote in his accompanying paper, that the use of language within the film was important and intentional, and the different ways that systems refer to alters has for a long time been a contentious point within DID communities. From what I can see, Dylan and Holly have been relatively receptive to criticisms, acknowledging the limitations that the short film has. Holly and Dylan have discussed specifically on the Healing My Parts podcast that they are aware that not everyone is a huge fan of the language used within the film, and acknowledge that language is a highly individualized thing between systems, and that there is not a unified list of DID terminology. Holly and Dylan Crumpler have also discussed across many podcast interviews that they are looking at expanding the Petals of a Rose into a potential television show or longer form movie, and plan to include a more diverse plural representation if that comes to fruition, because they recognize that by presenting a story informed primarily from Holly's experience, it is a very limited perspective, and that if you've met one system, then you've met one system. Experiences with multiplicity are highly diverse, and one depiction cannot represent them all. I don't think that this film is setting out to represent all kinds of DID, as it is portraying one person's singular experience, but it does point to a larger problem within DID representation in media, in that it largely focuses on systems with simple structures and fails to portray the diversity of multiplicity. And really what we need is more people with DID and multiplicity involved in the creation of these medias, so that we can build up the representation that reflects our lived realities. In the Jan Broberg Show podcast interview that Dylan and Holly did, Dylan discussed how in the over 70 movies and TV shows he has watched about DID, there were only 10 non-violent depictions of DID. And in several of the podcast interviews they have been on, Holly brought up the fact that there is basically no media out there that represents DID accurately, respectfully, and non-violently. And because of this, many systems have lowered their standards for media that represents them. I agree wholeheartedly with this point, and it is one of the reasons that I felt compelled to create this podcast, because I was so deeply frustrated at the state of explicit DID media representation, and I also wanted to offer explorations of media that maybe unintentionally could provide us with representation much better than the intentional representation that's out there. Dylan Crumpler wrote in the paper accompanying the movie that he hopes Petals of a Rose will give people with DID a new face in the media, accurately representing those with the condition that has been misportrayed so many times, while also serving as quality entertainment. During the initial screening within the System Speaks community, the audience members discussed how thankful they were for this representation within the film, and that they were hopeful that this could provide understanding of what it is like to live with DID, and this sentiment has continued to be echoed throughout the DID community. Holly has also spoken on the System Speaks podcast about how useful the film could be for clinical training, and that people have used it for that purpose. Petals of a Rose is not the most perfect representation of all time for DID, and given that it was an incredibly ambitious senior student thesis film, I think it would be deeply unfair to expect it to even be close to perfect. But it is still a huge step forward for DID representation and media that is accurate, respectful, and non-violent. However, as Emma from the System Speaks podcast discussed, this film does have a very restorative, healing presence within the community. We cannot change the way that the past media has harmed us, but the representation within Petals of a Rose is showing DID in a way that is very positive and healing, and it is the beginning of a hopeful change in the media landscape for DID representation.
And we deserve to be loved.
So, I am giving Petals of a Rose a 4.25 out of 5 for multiplicity representation. This is a good short film for representing a lived experience of DID. I have my criticisms, and I do think that there are areas that very much could be improved, but I am overall incredibly grateful that this short film exists, and that it has made so many systems feel seen and positively represented explicitly on screen. Maybe for the first time. We still have a long way to go to combat harmful media and stigma, but this film is a fantastic example of what could be possible in the future. Additionally, Dylan Crumpler is apparently working on a documentary about misrepresentation of DID in film, which I heard about through the Couple of Multiples podcast, which I am deeply excited for, as that documentary should hold a very similar scope to this podcast in exploring the ways that media has let us down in representation. But tell me, what did you think about Petals of a Rose? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you think it did a good job representing DID? Do you think my criticisms are too harsh, or maybe not harsh enough? I would love to hear from you. If you have any comments or suggestions for topics to cover on MeDIDa, or if you would like to be a guest on an episode, you can contact us on MeDIDa@gmail.com. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, Avodacat, where I'll be uploading episodes. You can also find us on Instagram, MeDIDa Podcast, and on Facebook, me.didea. I've been Avodacat, this has been MeDIDa, and it's time to switch out.